not from Amazing, it's from Analog. It was published in March 2011, and it also appears in my anthology of my 13 best stories of the last 10 years. It's called Non-Parallel Universes. It's called Astronomic Distance, Geologic Time. Gerald Homer Kahuli giggled. It was the happy laugh of a 2-year-old enjoying his first warm, wet experience of a puppy's tongue. If his father hadn't been delayed at the bus stop, he never would have seen the romping puppy in the window and decided there on the spot that it would be the ideal companion for his son. It'll be good companionship for the boy while I'm gone, he told his wife mere weeks later as he embraced her, lifted his bag to his uniform shoulder, and headed off to war. Yes, she replied with a smile, knowing exactly who would be cleaning up the messes, doling out the nightly food ration, and trying to manage 2 unruly creatures that had no concept of civilized behavior and therefore would bring so much trouble in her life while he was away. Still, after seeing the joyful smile on her son's face and knowing the companionship the dog would provide, hardly a substitute for a father, she accepted the inevitable. For the next few years, Gerald and Rex, the dog, were insufferable, happily destroying his mother's carefully tended victory garden, inflicting visible damage on his family shoes, and managed to transport enough dirt and grime indoors, although not all at once, to build a second yard. Only his entry into school eventually separated them, making each afternoon a delightful romping reunion when the bus deposited Gerald at the curb. During the first half of his life, Rex chased 75 squirrels, chased 20 cars and trucks, pissed on nearly 2,000 trees, bushes and poles, humped 3 bitches and uncounted legs, ate 500 pounds of dog food, occasional table scraps, and a quarter of the turkey and associated dressing his mother had prepared for Thanksgiving shortly after the war, when such luxuries became once again available. Rex also utterly destroyed every toy he was given except for a prized, saliva-soaked, grimy tennis ball that he lovingly dropped on the laps of unsuspecting guests. The age of technology had long passed, as had the age of arts and inevitably the age of knowledge. The race knew that there was little left for them, for even immortality can exhaust its attractiveness. Their last great project began when a few retrograde individuals decided to create something that would answer the question of why they, of all the creatures who must occupy the universe, were so lucky to be at the precise center. The answer was to send something to the distant edge of the universe, 10 billion light years away. The likelihood of their descendants hearing the answer after that much time was negligible. Even if they never learned the answer, the question would find to regain the long forgotten skills and knowledge so necessary to conceive and build something that would endure the trip. It took over 4,000 cycles for them to devise the plans, another 2,000 to muster the resources, and broken continual advances in every imaginable field. Part mechanism, part dream, and entirely an exercise in aesthetic perfection. Once released, the ships would sip on protons for sustenance and use dark energy for fuel. Were rugged enough, intelligent enough to deal with any obstacles encountered, such as black holes, maelstrom nebulae, and deep time pools. At near light speed, of entire systems. With great fanfare, the to form from the aggregation of star stuff, gases, and other random parts of the universe. Usually initially slow-moving, they rapidly gather speed so that in the first infinitesimally tiny fraction of the planned voyages, they achieved nearly 3/4 the speed of light. After that, they followed what would become a zigzag course of looping curves around black holes and dense stars to boost their speed by fractions of a percent. Since they started in a dense volume of their galaxy, it only took 50,000 years to reach the galaxy 6 billion light years away, a trivial though time-consuming distance for the indestructible and immortal Isafel. Must have heard the jingle of car keys as 12-year-old Gerald, who now insists on being called Jerry, entered the small room off the kitchen that they turned into the old dog's refuge. He whimpered as he tried to rise and then fell as his weak hind legs gave away. He finally settled for lifting his head and giving a few half-hearted wags of his tail. The dog's health had been going downhill for months. His hair had been falling out for some time, leaving bald spots on the bony protuberances of his arthritic hips. Jerry knelt and stroked the old dog's head for a moment, trying not to think of what they had to do. He's miserable, Jerry. You wouldn't want him to suffer, would you? His father had asked the night before. Jerry had protested putting Russ down for days, hoping against hope that the dog's health would improve, that it would somehow start eating again, recover, and be able to run and fetch and tumble and play as they always had, even while knowing that running, fetching, and tumbling were years and tears in their past. The best thing you can do is end his pain, son, his father insisted. You have to let him go. Jerry lifted Rex in his arms, refusing any assistance, and carried the old dog to the car, there to lovingly hold him close and dear all the way to the veterinarian, releasing his embrace only when they were about to give Rex his final injection, holding his best friend's head as his eyes closed, his breath stopped, and the long tongue that had licked Jerry's 2-year-old cheeks fell from his open mouth. Dogs don't live forever, so we have to love them for the brief time they have. You had a good life, Jerry. Be happy about that. His father's consoling words went unheard as Jerry sobbed softly at the loss of his best friend as they drove home. A billion years into the voyage, barely a tenth of the way toward the solar system, Isafel was moving at nearly 95% of light speed and ever so slowly accelerating. Her creators would have been proud of their accomplishment if their creators' descendants' had faded beyond memory 400 million years before, leaving only the 6 immortal spacecraft racing ever onwards as the only remaining evidence of their existence. Isafel periodically analyzed a distant dot of light, barely perceivable at the edge of the observable universe, to gauge how far she had yet to go. And in each instance, the answer was the same. She still appeared to be in the center of the observable universe. As Isafel covered another 8 million light years, cyanobacteria began staining Earth's rocks. As she covered many more millions of light years, the bacterial colonies wrote their signatures in Earth's geological records. Earth's oceans and seas were 250 million years ahead. Isafel pondered the observation problem over the next 2 million light years of voyage. While the still young Earth's volcanoes vomited the continent of Rodina and buried the stromalite formations under thick layers of magma, crushing the layers one by one as they filled the sky with fire and sulfur fumes. Jerry had long forgotten about his first beloved childhood dog after three more came into the household, grew old, and died. By the time he set off on his own, his parents had graduated to cats and their disgusting litter boxes, which was only marginal better than scooping dog poop off the sidewalk. Jerry often wondered how his life might have changed had the dryer in his apartment not broken down and forced him to carry his clothing to the laundromat. What happened next was the plot of 1,000 stories whose details consisted of a sock left in a dryer, a cute Hispanic smile, conversation over coffee, a brief fling, some disappointment, the inevitable breakup, and finally having Maria as one of his wife's bridesmaids 2 years later. Children followed, and although they gave Jerry more trouble than he felt he deserved, they eventually turned out to be decent adults who started on their own independent journey down life's path. He didn't regret the passing of their childhood or the loss of his own parents years before. There's a cycle, he's fond of saying. All things pass in time. When Isafel was nearly halfway to Earth, the deadly great oxygenation event wiped out the majority of bacterial life. A billion light years later, a single cell life forms dined on bacterial mats as the supercontinent of Rodina formed around Earth's equator. The atmospheric flow of rich, moist air was so disrupted by the continent that the polar caps and oceans froze solid, turning the planet into a 400 million year snowball. She had barely entered the Hirogen supercluster when the Earth warmed enough for a Cambrian explosion of multicellular life. The ocean swam in a variety of forms until a large chunk of debris screamed through the atmosphere, cracked one of the tectonic plates, and brought on 1,000 years of dark winter. The result was so devastating that the majority of ocean life died, leaving only those who feasted on the remains of others and the issue of volcanic vents. Isabel continued to use curving paths around huge gravitational masses to maintain her speed of 98% of the speed of light, as she covered another 100 million light years. During this brief time, Earth had become blessed with plants and true fishes. There are only 425 million light years left before Isabel would pass the Earth. 3 surviving children, 6 grandchildren, 16 great-grandchildren, and 2 great-great-grandchildren surrounded Jerry, Homer Kahili, on his final birthday in Flagstaff, Arizona's Happy Trails Assisted Living Facility. At 140, he experienced a lot of changes in the world: wars, love, and particularly during the latest phase of his life, misery. At the moment, he felt great, no doubt due to the generous dosage of happy juice the compliant hospice people were willing to provide whenever he asked, and most of the time when he didn't. The drugs took the edge off the pain and from the cancer and isolated him from awareness of the feeding tube, catheter, transfusion, and various monitoring devices that snaked through the bedclothes. There's so much equipment around him, he felt like one of his great-grandson's high school science projects. At the same time, all the gadgets and pipes meant he no longer had to worry about eating, taking a piss, or worrying if his bowels were going to move or not. The machines and the facilities, grossly underprepared state, took care of those mundane matters for him. On reflection, he thought he'd raised a good crew. No murderers, criminals, or lawyers among the bunch. Although one of the older great-grandkids was showing disturbing signs of political activism. Watch that one, he once warned his grandson. Shoot him if he tries to run for office. Jerry died quietly in his sleep at night, with no one near to hold his hand. The funeral was brief and attended mostly by family. Jerry's close friends had preceded him years before, and by the time he entered Happy Trails, he was past the age for developing friendship with his geriatric neighbors. The sons were saddened by Jerry's passing, but since they were all within insight of their own demise, they accepted the inevitability of death. All things pass, they repeated, their father's favorite saying at the funeral. Jerry's death was hardest on the grandkids, who were young and, like all youth, of the opinion that they were going to live forever. It was they who challenged the inevitability of it, who mourned the old man wouldn't be there for Christmas or any after, and who felt the pain of loss. After the ashes were put in the ground, everyone retired to hold the waste. The youngest of the great-great-grandchildren played between the legs of the great-grandkids, who were busy debating whether the caterer was going to serve the food or whether they could sneak a sniff of beer while their parents weren't looking. Eventually, his childhood puppy, Jerry sank deep into memory. Isabel was in the Uranus supercluster, 97% of the way to Earth, as plants and fishes flourished in Earth's melting ice. As it passed through the supercluster, continuing to adjust its course to take advantage of gravitational boosting, the warm oceans withstood the breakup of Rodina and the formation of the Pelagian supercontinent, while dinosaurs ruled the Earth. Isabel spent the next 150 million light years to precisely determine its position and puzzled over the fact that the observable universe, despite her obvious progress, now appeared to be almost 12 billion light years away in every direction. As she analyzed reasons for this, Rodina broke into Eurasia and Gowana, and by the time she reached a conclusion near which translated from the predominant native tongue as that great big bright thing up there, Gowana had broken in two, just in time for another massive meteor strike to send Earth into an aegis-long night. It was obvious to Isabel that the universe was continuing to expand, which meant that the journey would take longer than expected. Being immortal and uncaring of consequences, she merely digested this as another data point. Only seaweed thrived as a survivor of the plant family and would, when Isabel was another 50 million light years further along its wavering path toward the distant edge of the universe, have diversified into forests, grasses, vines, and plants that nourish the creatures who were starting to populate the edges of fragmented Gunwala land. The wonder of flowering plants occurred when Nisafel was 98.5% of its way to Earth, and after it had gone just a half a percent further, 25 million light years, Earth's mammals were struggling to survive one of the planet's periodic ice ages. When she was 250,000 light years nearer, the ice began to creep toward Earth's temperate region. The Swiss mountains began forming, and the ancient Appalachian Hills, a relic of Gondwana's refrain, began sinking into the crust. Sometime in the early 16th century, a somewhat scrawny Midland cobbler decided that he needed some way to differentiate himself from the unpleasant peasant down the road. They both couldn't be Arid of Midland, as he was damned if he was going to change the name the church had given him. Instead, he decided to align himself with the Lord and tell everyone he was Arid Kalspor of Midland. Jerry's descendants were justifiably proud of their family name, even if it had changed slightly to Kahili as it traveled down the centuries. There were few families, they frequently bragged, who could boast a documented history of 40 unbroken generations. There had obviously been many more, but since none of their ancestors had used a family name prior to Old Arid, discovering the identities of that worthy's precursors was futile. So it was a bitter day when Arid Kaholisphere, last named descendant, a bachelor and near hermit of a prospector on Mars, desolate Platina Olympia, passed away without issue, putting an end to Arid's long family line. Isafel had covered 99.9% of the distance to Earth, and thanks to a huge boost from a massive black attractor, was moving at 99 and 5/9 light speed when it passed Exilic, the name of the second planet's inhabitants had given it. None of them noticed, for all trace of their existence had disappeared a few hundred million years earlier. Neither would any of its browsing herbivores, even if they had intelligence, cared. Even at her incredible speed, Isafel took another 500,000 years to curve its path through the Andromeda galaxy. During its passage among the trillion stars that make up Andromeda, her passage was noted by the parapet collectivism, which sparked them to an examination of new physics. As Isafel covered the next 500,000 light years, the parapet achieved greatness beyond the dreams of their predecessors, only to disappear when their star went nova and destroyed their planet, their colonies, and the pathetically few ships creeping at half of light speed to escape the disaster. On Earth, the dawn humans strode out of Africa and began to spread across the land as Isafel passed M30, and 750,000 light years later, Homo sapiens had become the predominant human form. Humans scurried to occupy nearly every continent as the glaciers receded. The warming also caused an ice bridge that held the vast Missoula Lake in check to collapse and started the 2,000-year, 100-foot high, 6-mile-per-hour flood that would carve out much of the Pacific. Isafel neared the Canis dwarf as ash from the Yellowstone eruption darkened most of the continent and wiped out many of North America's megafauna. A mere 1,000 years later, the Earth continued heating up from its chill ice age. In the warming climate, it took only 8,000 years for humans to decimate the remaining large animal populations just before the Quaternary Ice Age dawned. Isafel was entering the Lagoon Nebula when the Chinese began scratching out the first elements of their written language on pieces of bone and hide. A small band of humans and dogs streaked across the bleak ice fields to find refuge against the cold as Isafel exited Andromeda. Both of the tribe's babies had died a month earlier, and 2 of the fecund felines had fallen prey to the bears, who were systematically hunting the human packs in competition with the increasingly scarce food supplies. To the north, the glaciers were steadily grinding down civilization, long abandoned crystal towers and massive dams that no human survivor cared about. There were more important things in life than a history so ancient that none of the tale spinners spoke of it. Later, as Isafel left the Lagoon Nebula, a 2-mile-wide chunk of rock slammed into what was formerly known as Seattle, splitting the Pacific plate and sending Earth into a 100-year darkness that wiped out 80% of animal and vegetable life and put an end to the age of mammals. There were no longer any humans to witness the demise of the hated bears. Isafel barely registered Ross 154 as it flashed by a fraction under the speed of light 10 years later. She was too preoccupied with the disconcerting discovery that the edge of the observable universe now appeared to be more than 13 billion light years away. Since there was clearly something wrong with the measurements, she shut that system down until she could find some way to correct the measurement problems. It might have been nice had some human, as the Perpid Collective had done, analyze the gravitational ripple of Isabel's passage, but her passage was 10 million years too late to catch mankind's brief interest in astronomy, or even its existence. Instead, the tiny ship flashed by a landscape much changed from when humans flew to distant stars and claimed dominion over all. Signs of all mankind's great works throughout the earth were gone. Its cities haven't been crushed by glaciers, buried by molten magma, or buried in a flood of floods. Isabel had been 0.891% faster. Its passage might have been noted by humanity, but that fraction of a fraction of time in which mankind existed was so small, so insignificant to Earth's eons long history, that it would have been a wonder of coincidence. Isabel covered another 50 million light years toward Arcturus as Earth's African plate continued driving northward to squeeze the Mediterranean into a wide river. Volcanoes erupted from the plate separation in the Indian Ocean, and a massive volcanic eruption buried the Hawaiian Islands under a 100-yard deep layer of ash and magma. By the time Isabel was a quarter of the distance, he had already covered further. Subduction of the tectonic plates had erased every sign that humanity had ever existed. Another 5 million light years further, and somewhere in Earth's forest of equatorial New Guinea, a multi-limbed creature raised its snout and bellowed its dominance of the world. 300 million light years after that, Isabel passed the planet Triplet, where the Sapien was publishing over whether it should toss some scraps to the small increpid who had begun staying near the campfire. Maybe it thought the small pest might be useful in finding game. Back on Earth, another ice age had descended as Australia collided with China, pushed northward by the relentless movement of Antarctica toward the equator. Scarcely 1,000 years later, and due to drastic changes in atmospheric flow, all the lands were covered in deep layers of ice. Only in the chilled depths did those creatures, chosen to remain in the sea, survive. Most fearsome of these included the volcanoes, marginally intact, and multiply stigmated squali. Long after blindness still failed to realize that despite her steady and accelerating progress, she remained at the center of the observable universe, whose distant speck of light would now appear, but she would not shut her system down to be 18 billion light years distant. Most of the stars, the planets she had passed during her journey, died. Clusters of galaxies had disintegrated in the far distant past, and atoms that might once have been part of Rex or Jerry, or even old Arid, combined with another that might have been part of old Earth, even Isabel's creators. The two atoms began to exert a slight attraction to other atoms in the process that might, in the fullness of time, coalesce into a new world and create, in the best of all possible universes, an intelligent race, a loving family, a laughing babe, and even a warm puppy's wet tongue. Finn.
Thank you. Okay, so thanks, Bud. The internet connection is not the greatest, so I hope this continues. Another round of applause for Bud. I'm going to read from a novelette, a relatively recent novelette that I wrote called Robinson Calculator. And it's in a anthology of mine called Urban Corridors, and you can also get it on its own on Amazon. And actually, you know, I usually at in-person cons read from my computer screen because it's sort of easier to do. But I think what I'll do here is actually read from a book. I first noticed the name on a headstone in the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Robinson Calculator. I mean, would they be so blatant to bury one of their own under a tombstone which plainly identified the deceased as calculator? That would bring hiding in plain sight to a whole new level. Now, I'm not making this up. You'd see this with your own eyes if you were in the right spot in the cemetery. I mean, I'd understand if you didn't. Most people are only visiting the cemetery because they're grieving for a loved one. But sometimes there's less grief than other times. You know, for a member of the family by marriage, you didn't really know the old guy all that well. And if there were no tears in your eyes and you looked in the right place, trust me, you'd see that name incised in stone too. Robinson Calculator. Now, I've been tracking those people for years, though obviously they're not really people. And the sight of that name on the headstone was a shard of ice in my heart because it meant they didn't care anymore. They didn't worry about who saw them or who knew them. I have nothing against them. In fact, I like them. They have spunk and style. My friend, a college buddy, had been married to one of them. That was the only reason I knew so much about them. Most people had no idea that calculators even existed. Dave's wife didn't use her maiden name. I chuckled to myself. Maiden doesn't seem quite right for a calculator, does it? Doesn't seem quite right for anyone anymore, but it just so happened that I liked this particular calculator, Dave's wife. Hell, more than that, I wanted her. I'd been very attracted to her. I had mixed feelings when they broke up. Dave and Leanne had planned on adopting, but he'd become increasingly obsessed with seeing his DNA come to life in a new being. And of course, there was no way that could happen with Leanne because she was a calculator. I've been on the verge of contacting her a bunch of times in the few years since they'd split up, but seeing that name on the headstone gave me new impetus. Now, just to be clear, I know that people have all kinds of last names derived from real objects, and I don't think for a minute that the holders of names derived from objects are somehow endowed with the physical properties of those objects. I mean, no one looked for gold or water when they saw Barry Goldwater years ago, though for all I knew, he sported a gold ring or watch, and his body was certainly made of whatever big percentage of water, like all human beings. Hey, there was a girl by the name of Samantha Sugar in my high school bio class, and I surely didn't think she was literally sweet, though she did have a sweet smile when she wanted to show it, and a sweet ass too in those snug cotton jeans. But the calculators, they were something else. The name apparently originated in Europe as far back as the golem and the real autonoma that preceded the mythical golem by centuries. Heron of ancient Alexandria had constructed automata far earlier, though there's no surviving evidence that he called them calculator as a last name or anything at all. They mostly had only one name back then anyway, right? The calculators, they were different. Whenever they originated, they started life as a family, a big family with aunts and uncles, as well as parents and children. And the family grew with first and last names. but the last name was always Calculator. I texted Leanne Calculator. How are you doing? Wow, she replied. Wild to hear from you. I'm watching Battlestar Galactica. Never gets old, she replied. Figured. I caught my breath. I was surprised by how good it felt to be in touch with her again. Hey, how about lunch in the next few days? Blue Ribbon Sushi on Sullivan Street? Now, I knew she lived in the village and worked from home. I also knew that Dave hated sushi and she loved it. Sure, she replied. How does Thursday sound to you? I ordered the big orange clam and she ordered the sweet Edie. We talked for a few minutes about inconsequential things. Then she took my hand. I'm not ready yet for anything more than friendship, she said. Okay. I know you're the kind of guy who thinks if she doesn't want my dick, she doesn't want my soul, but my mouth hung open. I filled it with a piece of clam. You see, I guess that's what I meant by spunk. You think I have a soul? She suddenly shifted focus. I mean, seriously. What, in a religious sense? I replied. I sipped some sencha tea, grateful for the change of topic. You know, I'm not sure I know what that means. If soul is something that God supposedly breathed into human beings, well, then I guess I'm agnostic. If it's just a word for what my brain contains, well, then yeah, I think you're my mental equal. I wouldn't think you were any different from me at all, in fact, if your name were not Calculator. Right, I said. Why do you use it? It's the law, Leanne replied. I laughed. What law would that be? The politicos now know about you? Common law, Leanne said. Actually, it goes back centuries. Ah, okay. So it's some kind of profound, deeply embedded custom. She gave me a look. I don't know if I'd call it profound. She bit into one of the crunchy fried shells of her shrimp, which had been served to her so quickly that its appearance on our table seemed almost surreptitious. But it's an important custom, I said, right? She nodded and crunched away. Who came up with it? Was it imposed upon you and your calculators? I asked her. She cleared her palate and throat with tea. We did. Why are you suddenly so interested? I told her about Robinson Calculator in the cemetery. Never heard of him, she said, and summoned the waiter. I'll have another Evie. I'm fine, I said to the waiter. And to Leanne, do you know all the calculators? Now she laughed. Of course not. Do you know all the human beings? Her laughter sounded like rain. I like rain. That Beatles song has always been one of my favorites. I sang a bar of Rain under my breath. In the rain. I heard it just yesterday on Peter Asher's show on Sirius XM radio. I assume there aren't as many calculators as humans, right? I said, and I summoned another waiter. More tea, please. I looked at Leanne, who nodded. For both of us. The waiter quickly bowed and left. No, we aren't as numerous as humans, Leanne said in a slow, mockingly exaggerated tones. But I doubt you know anything close to the names of every human being, even in your neighborhood or on your own block, right? I nodded. And the only reason you know about me, Leanne said, about my kind, is I was married to your friend Dave. The original waiter returned with Leanne's Evie and a pot of tea. He refilled our cups. Anything more? He asked politely. No, nothing more. To Leanne, I said, when do you think your people made a decision to put one of their names on such a publicly viewable tombstone? She considered for a moment. I don't know that they did. I mean, I believe you about what you saw on that tombstone, but I don't know if that was the result of a decision by the calculator. I took a picture of it, I said, and reached for my phone. I believe you, Leanne said. Okay, I said, and looked down for a moment at my tea. The pale green liquid seemed to shimmer in my cup. I don't know, in response to some soft sound wave. Then I realized there was indeed sound in the room, or at least at our table. Then I realized Leanne was softly singing. And she was somehow singing all the parts to the song, all the harmony, so softly that only I could hear her. I looked around at the people at the other tables. They couldn't hear her. It was like I was wearing earbuds and Leanne was in the phone. And it was beautiful. It was very beautiful. It was B.J. Thomas's Rock and Roll Lullaby. And she was singing it just for me. Sha la 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 la. It'll be alright. Da da da. My father had loved those songs, especially those Blossom and Beach Boy harmonies. He'd sung it more than half the time as we'd walk to the beach, sounding out each of those harmonies, but nothing like this. I never knew why he sang it. I did know I'd never told Leanne about that. Hell, I doubt I ever told Dave. Leanne smiled at me and stopped singing. I researched you, she said. After I texted you about lunch? After the first time I met you when I was with Dave, she replied. Now I smiled. She was very distracting. You think human beings put the name calculator on that headstone? I asked her. I wanted to stay focused. Leanne sucked on her ebi sushi, her eyes closed in appreciation. She sang the chorus again of Rock and Roll Lullaby in barely a whisper. She obviously didn't want to discuss this tombstone with Robinson calculator on it. I sipped my tea. It began to become public in the 1920s, Leanne suddenly said. It all began to change with RUR. Carol Capek's play, Rossum's Universal Robots, I asked. Yeah, Leanne said. That's when robots first entered the popular culture in a big way. That's what got Asimov going, and Data, and Westworld, and everything else. Capek gave robots their name. Did Capek know about you? I asked. About the calculators? I don't know. I wasn't alive back then. It occurred to me that I knew nothing about calculator lifespans. How old are you? I mean, she squeezed my hand. I had touched her hand before, and I knew it was warm, but for some reason, I was a little surprised by its warmth now anyway. I enjoyed this, she said, and stood. How much do I owe you? She fished for her phone. The waiter had yet to bring the bill. On me, I said, but I hope I didn't offend you with anything I said. You didn't, Leanne said, and she leaned over and kissed me on the lips to prove it. I believed her and thought, well, Dave was even more of a fool than I thought he'd been to leave her. I watched Leanne walk to the front of the restaurant. If it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, well, Leanne sure walked like a woman. All right, that's where I'll leave my reading of Robinson Calculator.